welcome to Based on a True Story, the podcast that compares your favorite Hollywood movies with history. Today we're going to learn about The Mummy. Now there are multiple films from cinematic history with that name, so to be specific, we are looking at the 1999 version, directed by Stephen Sommers, starring Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz. But it's actually Arnold Vosloo's character that we meet first in the movie. He is playing the high priest Imhotep. And in the opening scene of the movie, we learn of Imhotep's forbidden affair with Anaxunamun. She is the mistress of Pharaoh Seti I. When Seti discovers their relationship, Imhotep and Anaxunamun turn on him and kill him. But then the Magi, Pharaoh's bodyguards, find out, so Anaxunamun takes her own life, trusting that Imhotep can resurrect her. But Imhotep is caught by the Magi and subjected to a curse reserved for the worst offenders. That curse is called the Hamdai, and they are mummified alive and buried in Hamunaptra, the city of the dead. So that sets up how the mummy is made back in ancient Egypt, and he's buried under the sand for thousands of years. To the movie fast forwards to 1923, where we meet Brendan Fraser's character, Rick O'Connell. He is a French foreign legionnaire who happened to discover Hamunaptra during a battle. And then a few years after that battle, he's in a Cairo prison when Rachel Weisz's character, Evelyn, along with her brother Jonathan, find him. Jonathan's played by John Hannah in the movie. So that's kind of our trio. We have Evelyn, Jonathan, and then Rick O'Connell is leading them on the expedition to find Hamunaptra, or return there in O'Connell's case. And this is all alongside a group of rival treasure hunters from America. So you have a bit of America versus Britain going on there as well. The American group is led by Jonathan Hyde's character in the movie. He's a guy named Dr. Alan Chamberlain. While the groups are at Hamunaptra, they accidentally revive Imhotep by reading from the Book of the Dead, and that's when we meet him as a powerful mummy. He's trying to resurrect Anaxunamun by sacrificing Evie, Evelyn, who he believes is the reincarnation of his lost love. The resurrected Imhotep unleashes the biblical 10 plagues of Egypt, causing chaos and destruction. Rick, Evie, and Jonathan team up with the leader of the Magi, a guy named Ardith Bey, who's played by Oded Fehr in the movie. And together they race against time to find the only artifact capable of defeating Imhotep, the Book of Amun-Ra. And then the big battle at the end, the trio manages to find the Book of Amun-Ra. Evie reads a passage from the book, making Imhotep mortal before Rick stabs him. Mortally wounded, Imhotep is dragged down into eternal suffering. The city of Hamunaptra collapses into the sand, burying everything under the sand once again. And of course, at the very end, Rick O'Connell gets the girl, which we learn about in the sequels to the franchise, but we're just sticking with one movie today. And speaking of today, we get to pick the brain of Dr. Aidan Dodson, Senior Research Fellow at the Department of Archaeology and Anthropology at the University of Bristol. Dr. Dodson has done a ton of research into ancient Egypt, but he also has a fantastic series of books called Lives and Afterlives, I'll link to in the show notes, all about the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, such as Seti I, the pharaoh at the beginning of the movie that we're talking about today. But if you're like me, you might recognize Dr. Dodson from various documentaries about Egypt. For example, to give you a peek behind this episode, I actually reached out to Dr. Dodson to see if he would want to talk about the mummy while I was watching him on a Discovery show called Expedition Unknown. But before we chat with Dr. Dodson, let's set up our game. 2 truths and a lie. Now, if you're new to the show, here's how it works. I'm going to give you 3 things. 2 of them are true, and that means one of them is just an all-out lie. Are you ready? Okay, here they are. Number 1, they really did use scarab beetles to consume the flesh of those cursed in ancient Egypt. Number 2, Thebes is the Greek name for Luxor. Number 3, the mirror trick in the movie is a real thing. Got him? Okay, now as you're listening to our story today, your challenge is to identify which one of those things that I just said is a lie. And then, of course, we'll do a recap at the end of the episode to see how well you did. All right, now it's time to connect with Dr. Aidan Dodson about the historical accuracy of The Mummy. Before we dig into some of the details of the movie, if you were to take a step back and give 1999's The Mummy an overall letter grade for its historical accuracy, what would it get?
Ooh, I think it would be probably a D- or an E.
Okay.
The points where it actually has something to do with the real ancient Egypt are few and far between.
Ancient Egypt did exist, and that's it, pretty much.
Yeah, but interestingly, that even the country that it's set in does not look like Egypt.
Oh, really?
Yeah, okay, they take it further with the latest ones in the franchise, but basically most of what we see there is not recognizably Egypt of any period, I suppose. There are a few things which sort of people might think might be Egypt, but no, it's it's a straight. As I when it first came out, when somebody asked me about it, I said basically it's in a land which they're calling Egypt, but is fundamentally more like Middle Earth or some other fictional venue.
Okay. It's got the sands, and so I guess for the American movie viewing audience, it's okay. That's Egypt.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, I suppose so. Yeah, but of course, but then if you know Egypt, there's a lot of it which isn't sand. So it's a caricature of what somebody who's never been to Egypt thinks it might be like. I think that's the best way of describing it.
Very good. Very good. Well, the movie starts by kind of setting up some of the people involved in this story. We hear about Pharaoh Seti I, his wife Anaxunamun, the high priest Imhotep. And if we're to believe the movie's version of history, Imhotep had an affair with Anaxunamun, and when they were discovered, the two of them killed Seti. Are those real people? Did the affair that we see in the movie really happen?
The only person who's real is Seti I. He was a genuine king of Egypt. His mummy is in the Cairo Museum. He's the father of Ramesses II. So he's an important figure in Egyptian history. The thing is, he never had a wife called Ankhserenamun. He never had an official called Imhotep. And as far as we can tell, he died in his bed of natural causes. We do know he died relatively young, but there's sort of no signs of any foul play or anything on the mummy.
Okay. So they did change things quite a bit. What the concept, obviously, being his wife, you wouldn't want to have an affair there, but they really seem to make it a big deal that, Imhotep is the high priest, and having an affair with the pharaoh's wife is, they have her outfit basically painted on, like you're not allowed to touch her. They have that kind of thing on there.
Yeah, there's a couple of interesting things. The first is the choice of the name for the queen. In fact, it's a garbled version of the wife of Tutankhamun's, actually, his wife, and is lifted directly from the original 1932 movie, where the heroine is called that. And likewise, Imhotep is lifted directly from the 1932 Boris Karloff film as well. So there's a lot of this film, because at the time originally it was presented as going to be a remake of the 1932 classic, or possibly the Hammer horror version in the 1950s. But it wasn't that. All they did was picked a few things. For example, the names of the hero and heroine, or anti-hero and heroine.
Okay, yeah. So they're pulling from multiple sources, it sounds like, and then kind of turning it into the Middle Earth / ancient Egypt fictional area to create this.
I think the thing that the original idea was possibly to do a remake, and then they decided, no, let's change this bit until the relationship with the original version is sort of isn't there at all.
Makes sense. Well, I want to ask about something in the movie that we see, kind of the talking about Imhotep. He transfers into the mummy through what the movie calls the Hamdai. The movie explains this as being the worst of all ancient Egyptian curses. It's reserved only for the most evil of blasphemers. And the key to this curse is basically keeping the mummy sealed in his sarcophagus, because if he's released, then he becomes this super powered, walking disease, bringing back the 10 plagues of Egypt, strength of ages, the power over the sands, and the glory of invincibility. Did the ancient Egyptians have any sort of curse like the Hamdai that we see in the movie?
Not in the slightest, no. The only curses we have are basically against embezzling funerary endowments. There's not even anything about if you rob my tomb, you're going to be. Yeah, it's very much sort of almost a transactional kind of thing, and certainly the idea of that kind of thing as being the worst possible punishment. Now, we know they had capital punishment, and we know that for some things, tomb robbing, you could be impaled. Otherwise, punishments tended to be. I see. They probably were straightforward executions, but often having your nose and ears cut off and sent to work in the mines. That sort of thing is the really nasty kind of stuff. And when you've got somebody who is guilty of a state crime, it seems that if you're high enough placed, you're allowed to commit suicide. because we do have the records of the trials of people who were responsible for assassinating a later pharaoh, and basically the it seems fairly clear that these some of the more senior ones were allowed sort of to go off and kill themselves, but otherwise it's their fate overtook them is the otherwise is the word used. So, but there is no evidence for any kind of sort of particularly sort of nasty or special kind of punishments like that.
Okay. Yeah, that was something that the first time I watched this movie back, I think I saw it in the theaters when it first came out. But I was like, wait a minute, why wouldn't some pharaoh be like, I'm going to purposely have this curse, and yet it's gonna suck to be killed that way, but then I'm going to become into this invincible superpower, right? Like to get that power on the other side.
Yeah, and also the other point is that surely by sealing him up like that is preserving his body, and that was the way that was what people wanted. It seems that if you were particularly bad, you were burned, which is the way of destroying your afterlife. So actually the whole idea of preserving somebody a special way as a curse is completely it's the wrong way round. The point that if somebody was particularly bad, the thing is you destroy every trace of them on Earth, because part of the idea is that while your body survives, your soul survives, and everything else. And also, even more important and interestingly, that if your name survives, the whole point about sort of somebody who's done something really, really dreadful is to not only destroy their body, but destroy any mention they ever existed. So doing this to Imhotep is completely the opposite to what you'd expect to do it to somebody who's done things like particularly horrendous.
Okay, that makes perfect sense because I can't think of any names off the top of my head. I'm sure you have a lot more, but I know I've seen things about the ancient Egyptians carving off names and things like that to try to erase them from history.
Exactly, and that's the whole point. And there's the bottom line thing is, providing at least your name survives on Earth, you'll never be dead. So they say, write a book and live forever. But say the opposite way around, they say take the name away, destroy the body, and then you will be as though you never were.
Okay, I want to. There was something. So you're kind of talking about the curse there in the movie. We see the curse affects the people who open Imhotep's canopic jars most because he needs those to regenerate. There's a group of American treasure hunters who fall prey to the mummy so he can start that regeneration process. But the impression that I got from the movie was they were pulling from the curse of the pharaohs, which is something that I've heard about. But is there anything from history to suggest the curse of the pharaohs is actually a real thing like the movie implies?
The slightest. No, it was made up by a journalist in 1922. Basically, when they were excavating the tomb of Tutankhamun, they were basically journalists hanging around all the time. And one of the journalists was actually an ex-Egyptologist, who I think was rather embittered by the fact that because he'd once been an Egyptologist, he might be allowed in and get some special scoop. But basically, they turned around and said, "No, you're now one of them. You can." And I get the feeling, although we haven't got it in words of one syllable, but he sort of spun various stories with his fellow journalists because he'd got the pedigree of being a former Egyptologist, and he made basically, as far as we make it, he made it up. The whole thing. And what's really ironic is the guy who we think was responsible for making it up, when he died of cancer 10 years later, they alleged he died of the Pharaoh's curse, when actually he was the person who'd made it up in the first place. So yes, they say the only sort of curses which exist are what we might call ones against embezzlement, because when you built your tomb, there was a need to have offerings regularly placed in it. And what you'd often do is then endow some agricultural land to provide food to go to your tomb. And the concern was that this might be embezzled and the resources diverted to somebody else. So that's really where, when we see curses, they're really against that kind of thing, rather than these are the classic, if you rob my tomb, I'll do something nasty to you. I think that's sort of almost implicit that's the case. And we know that sometimes that mummies are often burnt by robbers, and we think that may be by the robbers to try and stop the dead person taking revenge. But that's not because there's a curse. That's just simply, if you do something to the dead will come and get you.
You may have already kind of alluded to this, but in the movie's storyline, it takes place mostly in a city called Hamunaptra. And the movie explains Hamunaptra as being known as the city of the dead because it was the ancient burial site for the sons of pharaohs. Is Hamunaptra an actual place?
Nope. And in fact, what Hamunaptra is actually a mispronunciation of probably Amun-Ra, the chief god. The Hamunaptra certainly doesn't exist, and it doesn't look like any Egyptian cemetery I've ever come across. Basically, the setup in Egypt was you'd have the ordinary town, and then there'd be, normally to the west of it, because that's where the dead live, there would be a cemetery, which would be, depending on the period, would just look like just an area of desert with a few, or it may be a cliff with some tombs cut into it or whatever. But nothing. What they show as Hamunaptra looks a bit like a cross between the Temple of Karnak and somebody's sort of fantasy. It's that sort of thing. But I think they've clearly, that name, the only way they can get it for, I think, is just Amun-Ra, is distorting Amun-Ra. And there's another little thing which always got me. The moment I saw it, and my wife always hates it if I watch anything like this because I'm always just sniping at it. There's the bit where they're hurrying off from Cairo to Hamunaptra and they go by steamer. What's wrong with the overnight express train? By the time this is set, which is presumably 1920s-ish, there's an express train which can get you from Cairo to Luxor, which I assume is what they're calling at Hamunaptra, in like 10 hours. So why get a paddle steamer which takes days? One little question. Again, this is a question about sort of bearing very little resemblance to Egypt. And there's also that sort of slave market thing earlier on. You might have got that in about 1500, but you hadn't had anything like that in Egypt, for centuries. So again, it's not Egypt at all. It's a fantasy land which they're calling Egypt, and they've sort of brought in a few bits and pieces which people recognize. Ooh, that's Egypt, but it's as an actual place where all this stuff is happening. There's no resemblance whatsoever.
Well, I have to ask kind of the flip side of the city of the dead is the city of the living, which in the movie is where Imhotep lives, Thebes. Is Thebes a real place?
Yeah, Thebes certainly is a real place. It's the Greek name for what we now call Luxor, and that was the religious capital of Egypt from about 1500 BC through to about 1100 BC. So during the very high point, and certainly during the time that Seti was. And we have temples of Seti the First there. We've got, that's where his tomb is and everything else. So the idea of there being that is is fine, and that is what we've got now on the east bank at modern Luxor, and the city of the dead, the necropolis, is on the west bank. So that east-west division is certainly there. And so, as I said earlier on, I think in most parts of Egypt, there would be the area of the living, and then there would be the cemetery. So ideally off to the west, if the topography allowed that. Sometimes it's off to the east, and they do some weird and wonderful things to try and sort out the orientation. But basically, there is that basic division there.
Okay, and that doesn't seem like it's anything unique to ancient Egyptians. I mean, even today, we have cemeteries, and you see cities in. I live in America. You see cities in America where the cemetery is kind of off to the side, and as the city grew, but it's how it was.
Yeah, exactly. I think so. I've traveled quite a lot in the States. Just outside San Francisco, you've got this whole city of the dead of Colma and everything else going off to the south. So yeah, that idea is. But so I think the Egyptian issue is it normally should be to the west, whereas we don't quite do that. But it is helped, of course, by the fact that you've got a north-south river. So there's a west bank and an east bank, and that sort of. And generally speaking, providing the topography allows it, you will be buried on the west. It's just some places where the cultivated floodplain goes off so far. If you wanted to go and sort of visit Granddad's grave, you'd have a day's journey. So they muck you around a little bit. But yeah. So I think they've taken clearly what is Luxor, Thebes as their model, and sort of then dropped into it this Hamanputra concept.
There's another element to Hamunaptra being the place of the resting place of the wealth of Egypt. There's a scene in the movie that is this huge, big room filled with all sorts of gold and statues and just huge piles of gold just there. It looks exactly like what you would expect a treasure room to look like, themed with ancient Egypt with all these statues. Do we know if the Egyptians had any huge treasure rooms like we see in the movie?
Not like that. I think this, if they did, any treasure which they had, and they certainly had they certainly had it, would have just been in small storerooms with under lock and key. You wouldn't pile it into all that kind of thing. Yeah, I think what you've got then is this idea of the legendary wealth of Egypt. The fact that you could take it with you in your tomb. So royal tombs were fairly well packed with gold and stuff. Look at the stuff they found in Tutankhamun's tomb. That's sort of a good example of that. But certainly nothing like that kind of thing. And that's just simply just sort of an excuse for the set builders to have fun, I suppose. Because I think it's almost a trope from all kinds of these sort of, whether it's Indiana Jones or whatever. There's always this torch lit great hall with whatever the stuff is in the middle of it, and we have no examples of anything like that at all.
Okay, you mentioned the torchlight, and that was something I wanted to ask about because in the movie we see Rachel Weisz's character Evelyn. She calls it an ancient Egyptian trick where they reposition mirrors above the ground to then cast light underground, and that made me wonder: how did the ancient Egyptians see underground? Did they just use fire that then would burn up their oxygen, or was there some sort of ancient trick like we see in the movie?
No, but actually, the trick which she's using is actually the trick they use nowadays to light up tombs.
Okay.
By using mirrors. If you visit some of the tombs in Egypt today, most of them have now got LED lighting and everything, but there's a few where they still haven't got, so therefore they'll use some mirrors to sort of to bounce some sunlight. Now, basically, what they used was little floating wick oil lamps, but with very, very pure olive oil, and apparently, if you put salt in it, it doesn't smoke. So that's clearly what they used for it. The idea of flaming torches would again they look fun on Hollywood, but you've never actually used such a thing because it would just mess up the paintwork.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I was thinking that, in more enclosed spaces, like you would lose oxygen even faster if you had this huge torch and then the light would go out and then you would go out.
But again, it's not the sort of light which you want, because people who are actually down there are going to be the artists. They want to actually be able to see properly. So therefore, they want a nice, pure light, which you can get from sort of olive oil, little oil lamps. This sort of flickering torch is the last thing you want to do if you're trying to get your colours right and so on. So, though again, the flaming torches are, as I think, a standard. If you go back into Hollywood history, that's always what you do if you're going underground. Somewhere you have flaming torches. You don't go with a little oil lamp or anything like that.
There are a group of people in the movie that we see called the Magi, and they are, according to the movie, Pharaoh's bodyguards. They were there when Seti was killed. They're the ones to perform the curse on Imhotep as punishment for killing Seti. And then for thousands of years, they're tasked with making sure that the mummy doesn't escape. How well do you think the movie does showing Pharaoh's bodyguards, the Magi?
Well, first of all, they don't exist to start. Although the Magi, Magi, are basically the Egyptian police force. It's a name for policemen, effectively. So they're nothing special. They're sort of they're the Egyptian paramilitary police. The idea of then any kind of continuity like that is just this doesn't work in the sense of looking at the history of Egypt from that point onwards. With the multiple sets of disjuncture with the Persians, with the Assyrians invading, the Persians invading, the Greeks invading, the Romans invading, the Arabs invading, etc., the chance of any kind of survival of this kind of sort of little band of brothers kind of thing throughout generations is just absolutely silly. But they've taken that actually from the 1932 Mummy film, but when you've simply got, where in fact the mummy is that person, is actually the person who has sort of has lived on through time. So yeah, it's again one of those things where it's just, you know, it's a fun bit of the story, but it just doesn't bear any resemblance. But I think again, it's something which you find in quite a few films. This idea of this order of monks or whatever it is who've sort of carried on, who've gone through history, and they're the ones who are still, it's passed on from, you know, father to son kind of thing.
Yeah, that was definitely the feeling that I got from them, was that yes, this was a passed on through generations, and they were doing this, and apparently didn't do a very good job because they didn't protect the pharaoh, and they also didn't protect the mummy, and so they failed on multiple points.
Exactly. I do wonder whether the idea in part, and let's say it's not original for this particular mummy film, is of course you have got hereditary families in Palestine who are the guardians of the sacred places. So the idea of a family who they're the ones who control the keys to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and stuff like that. So I think that's sort of where the concept might have come, but that's sort of only over the last, and that's lasted 500 years or so. So it's not not to be sniffed at, but that is in the context of a sort of a culture which continues to sort of recognise the idea of of these kind of guardians. But if you try and take it over 3,000 years, it becomes just silly.
Well, we talked about the city of the dead, but there's another concept in the movie called the Book of the Dead, and that's what the mummy Imhotep is trying to bring back the love of his life. I was going to say his wife, but that was actually the pharaoh's wife. Anaxanumun is trying to bring back the love of his life. And so reading from the book is what wakes the mummy up to begin with. Later on, it's actually the Book of Amun-Ra that is going to be the one to kill the mummy. Are the Book of the Dead and the Book of Amun-Ra, are they based on real things?
The name Book of the Dead is based on something real, although actually the document was called by the ancient Egyptians the Book of Coming Forth by Day. And it was called the Book of the Dead by the local villagers in the 19th century when they started finding these scrolls, and they were found on the dead. So therefore they've been called the Book of the Dead because of that. The ancient Egyptians didn't call them the Book of the Dead, they called it the Book of Coming Forth by Day. And what the Book of Coming Forth by Day, or aka the Book of the Dead, was a guidebook to being dead, effectively. It was a set of spells which helped you transform from being a dead person to being an eternal being.
So passing through death into the afterlife, basically, it sounds like.
Yeah, and there's lots of things. There was things you had to know certain passwords to get through gateways, and all those sorts of things. And therefore, if you could afford it anyway, you had a scroll in with your mummy, which had the Book of the Dead on it. Alternatively, you could have it painted on the walls of your tomb, or if you couldn't afford the whole thing, you could have extracts from it. So basically, there is this thing, but it's all about being dead. It's not coming back, and it's coming back to life, but coming back to life in the next world. It's ensuring that you are able to then, say, pass through into the next world and continue on for eternity on the other side. The Book of Amun-Ra doesn't exist at all. I think there's also, she mentioned at one point, a Book of the Living as well, which again doesn't exist. I think it's simply because the producers, thinking there was a thing called the Book of the Dead, but actually it's the Book of Coming Forth by Day. We must have a book of the living to go with it. And I seem to recall from the film, so it's a long time ago as I saw the film, but she's actually looking at what seems to be a cast of part of the Rosetta Stone when she's reading this as well. So the props are a little bit bizarre in places.
Yeah, I think if I remember right, the Book of the Dead is kind of it's like a darker black, and then the Book of the Living is this gold treasure, and which is why a lot of the treasure hunters are looking for it, is because it's this golden book, right? And
no, it's one of those things where they picked up this Book of the Dead and then run with it to produce the rest of the thing.
Well, according to the movie's version of events, the mummification process for Imhotep and his priests happened while they're still alive. The movie kind of makes a point to mention this. Although the movie does mention that that's kind of a special case for the curse to mummify them alive. But we do know that mummies are a real thing. But obviously, they're not tied to the curses like we see in the movie. So for those of us who aren't familiar with the reason behind the mummies, can you share some more historical context that we don't see in the movie at all around why ancient Egyptians made mummies?
Basically, the way the Egyptians looked at things when you died, effectively you split into a number of different elements, most of which were spiritual elements, but also the body was still part of you. And although they don't provide the full detail, the implication is to have had to enjoy a fully rounded next life. All your various bits still needed to be in existence. So therefore, the body needed to be preserved so it could continue on playing its role. But exactly what that role is never made clear. I'm not sure even actually the Egyptians fully understood what it meant. It probably meant something, in 5000 BC. But by the time you get to later periods, it's just what you do. So basically, the idea is to preserve the body. At minimum, you wrap it in some bandages to hold it all together. And then, if you can afford it, various chemical processes are carried out, which then desiccate the body. So effectively, unless it gets wet or catches fire, it's absolutely, it'll survive forever. And that's the idea. The body should survive and so on. And it's one of the reasons why the penalties for tomb robbery were death, because if you were destroying somebody's body, mummified body, you were then messing up their afterlife. And so therefore it was effectively, posthumous murder if you were going to damage a mummy. And so we do know that in some cases they set fire to the mummy, probably to try and stop the spirit taking any kind of revenge. So the mummy is a really quite important node, if you like, in the whole thing. But again, if Imhotep had done something particularly horrendous, the last thing you would want to do is mummify him, because that's the way you guarantee him a continuing existence. So therefore, what you would do is execute him and then burn him. That's what you would do if you in a real ancient Egypt, to somebody who was that horrendous, done something that horrendous.
It makes me wonder, because I think of some beliefs of afterlife now, and we think that the concept of ghosts and things like that, where basically those spirits can go through objects, but then you're talking about burning the mummies to keep them from coming back. Is there a belief that that mummies could come back and haunt or curse or whatever the term might be, like people in this world?
Not the physical body itself, but they certainly believe that spirits could come back and do stuff. And in fact, there's one version of the spirit called the Ba, which actually was supposed to be able to come back and sort of sit outside the tomb and enjoy the sunset and things like that. And there were concerns that that a malevolent spirit, ghost, could do harm in this world. There's one high priest's wife who there is some very interesting texts written which went in her tomb, suggesting that she hadn't died, shall we say, on good terms with her husband. And there's sort of I would love to know what was going on there, but it's clear. And there are also some things where you do get texts. They're called letters to the dead. You could actually write a letter to your, and basically saying, why are you coming back and sort of disturbing me? Why are you causing? There's a problem in the household, and it's sort of thought to be the dead person. So the dead certainly could interfere in this world, but in a spiritual form only. The idea of actually having a mummy sort of getting up and wandering around isn't there at all. But certainly the idea of spirits, and particularly if you've died a bad death or you're unhappy, there are Egyptian ghost stories. There's one where we've got a guy who's visiting the cemetery, and he gets visited by a ghost who tells him his life story. So we do certainly have that side of things.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I was really curious about that because that's something that you it's not so different from a lot of beliefs now of like people coming back and interacting with spirits and things like that, but also the concept of like you're talking about, putting the book of the dead or the map into the sarcophagus so that they can read it. It kind of makes me think, okay, they can actually physically interact with this perhaps, or it's just kind of a mixture of a lot of different things that I think are not uncommon today, just called different things and kind of evolve from that.
I think there's a common human desire not to see death as the end. The difference is then is what then happens beyond. Are the dead then gone to another place, or are they still having some kind of interaction with you? Because each a proper Egyptian tomb, there's the burial chamber, there's also a chapel which goes with it, and in the chapel is what we call a false door, which is the interface between the two worlds, and where offerings will be placed in front of that to pass through to get to the other side. Because one of the things Egyptians are always terrified of is going hungry in the next world. And in fact, a lot of the texts on coffins and tomb walls are all about making sure there's enough food, drink, and also clothing available. But also, then ideally, they like the real stuff, the fresh stuff as well. Hence, I was talking about these funerary endowments of fields to provide for food offerings. So that ideally that would be brought on a regular basis, and that would pass through the false door. And also the spirit would come to the false door to take on the food. And this one form of the spirit, the bar, could actually then come out and just sort of visit this world.
There's another kind of concept that we were as we're talking about mummies. I mentioned it briefly with the canopic jars.
But one thing about canopic jars is they have 5 canopic jars in the movie. There are only ever 4 of them.
Oh, okay. Okay, I wanted to ask about that because you were talking about how with ancient Egypt kind of not really resembling ancient Egypt, so it made me wonder with the mummification process that we see in the movie with the canopic jars and even the location of the sarcophagus seems to make a difference in the movie. In this case, we see Imhotep, because he did this bad thing, his sarcophagus is buried near the base of Anubis, which means, according to the movie, it was kind of funny to have these contrasts. It was either somebody of great importance or he did something very, very bad. Those are the only two reasons why he might be there. And of course, in the movie, it's the latter. But is there anything from ancient Egypt, like a time period where the mummification process that we see in the movie resembles that at all?
Not really, no, because effectively all Imhotep is doing is he's being wrapped up. There's not there because to mummify him properly, you have to take all the organs out. You have to then stick it. Desiccate the body for a month and all those sorts of things. So it doesn't really, the whole point is that you're going to be very, very dead when you've had your brain taken out, you've had all your organs taken out. There's not really much you can do. Yeah, and also the interesting point is that although of the organs which are taken out, most of them are put in the 4 canopic jars. The brain is either left in place or lost altogether, because the brain, you can't remove it in a form you can then desiccate it and put it in a jar effectively. So about half of the mummies have had their brains removed altogether, and the other half there's a sort of shriveled husk of the brain in the head.
Okay. There's a kind of a key villain that we see in the movie that I want to ask about. When during the mummification process with Imhotep, we see the scarabs, and they're thrown into the sarcophagus, and they basically eat him alive. Just waves, and then we see different points in the movie too. We see the scarabs eating humans, like they cover up some of them, and then in a matter of seconds they leave, and there's just this husk of a person left. Were scarabs used by ancient Egyptians the way that we see in the movie?
Not in the size of poor defensive little scarab beetle. They've been terribly slandered and libelled in that. Yeah, he's just a little beetle who wanders around the desert. The reason why the scarab is something for the ancient Egyptians is because there's 2 sides which probably link together. One is that the scarab beetle pushes around a ball of dung, which is his food. And they look upon that as though it's the sun being pushed over the horizon in the morning. So when you look at the Egyptian sun god, he goes through a number of different transformations, but his final one before the dawn is into a scarab beetle, at which point he then pushes the sun over the horizon, as though he was the ball of dung. So that's the reason why the scarab is a really, really important thing. It's the vehicle for starting the day, effectively. So that's the reason why it's an important thing there. But also, the word for scarab is chepa in ancient Egyptian, and chepa also means to come into existence. And therefore, again, the scarab is a symbol for, say, both rebirth, because the idea of the sun coming up over the horizon is equated with the idea of rebirth, because the sun is being reborn. The thought is the sun has died at sunset, is being reborn in the morning, and also has come into existence. So cheparu. So it's an important concept of coming into existence. It just so happens that because the way that Egyptian writing works is that pictures of things with the same consonants as a concept may be used for that concept, because we don't know the short vowels of ancient Egyptian. So possibly it may have been Chopa is the scarab beetle and Chepa is to come into existence. But if they've got the same consonants, they can be used for the same thing. It's the same reason why the sign for life is actually a sandal strap, because Ankh, which is sandal strap, and life, also Ankh, if you haven't got the short vowels, have got the same consonants. So that's how these things sort of work. And that's the reason why this scarab is an important thing, because it is a form of the sun god, and it's the most creative form of the sun god. And in the context of the dead, you want your ball of dung, if you like, to be pushed over the horizon by the scarab. So that's the reason why scarabs are such a big thing. They're poor little inoffensive little desert creatures who.
Not according to the movie. I mean, they sure seem pretty.
Now, there are flesh-eating beetles, which actually doctors sometimes use now for cleaning up, badly damaged wounds and things. So they picked up the fact there are beetles which will eat flesh, but not scarab beetles.
So when we see them, the scarabs, is it more it's not really referring to the beetle itself, but the god in form of the scarab? It sounds like in a lot of contexts. Okay.
Yeah, it's basic. There's a lot of. It's either the sun god himself, or it is an embodiment of the idea of coming into existence.
Okay. But neither one is really like, this is the beetle, necessarily, like talking about the beetle itself, No,
and the reason why they've picked on it is because they've seen the beetle pushing this ball of dung around, which is where the idea probably comes from. But this idea is probably sort of 5,000, 6,000 years ago, long before. And again, that by the time this is all set, which I'm assuming, because Seti is around about 1300 BC, which I assume is where that bit of it is set. It's just probably what they do. And I suspect most people, unless you were sort of a priest, probably would have no idea why a scarab beetle is such a thing. It's just, that's what we do. That's what we have.
Yeah, at that point, it's just you believe it because that's what you've been taught your whole life. Yeah,
that's exactly.
Something that we see throughout all of the movie. There's trap doors and booby traps and secret chambers, especially in Hymenoptera. And obviously the sets are made up for the movie. But for those of us who haven't really explored ruins of ancient Egypt in person, I have to ask, do any of the Egyptian ruins have the type of booby traps and secret chambers and trapdoors that we see in the movie?
So not booby traps. We do get at certain periods of Egyptian history some quite elaborate security in tombs, whereby you have got corridors which lead nowhere. You've got trapdoors in the floor or ceiling and so on. So that sort of thing does exist. And there's a couple of occasions where they are actually moved in a vaguely mechanical manner by using sand as a hydraulic fluid, effectively. So that idea that the Egyptians could do that kind of stuff is true. but it's only at very specific periods of time, and it's always not to catch somebody out in the sense of sort of trap them or whatever. It's to close off corridors and things so they can't be penetrated by robbers, because that's the key thing. It's all to do with keeping robbers out. Otherwise, I think most things were just simply trusted to to locked doors and guards when it came to sort of stuff outside. So you've just got a couple of periods, none of which actually are overlap with when this sort of the ancient bit of this is set, where you have this kind of sort of quite elaborate attempt to try and mislead robbers and seal off things.
Okay. Yeah, I assumed that a lot of that was very fictionalized for the movie, but I had to ask.
Yeah, and I think also a lot of it is then taken from previous movies. There's Land of the Pharaohs is a classic one, whereby you have all the sand sort of closing off a pyramid and things like that. So again, I think an awful lot of the Mummy is derivative. They've taken a lot of stuff from previous movies and sort of just juggled it around a bit, and so in some cases possibly not fully understood where the particular trope actually came from. But
yeah, well, you mentioned with the torches, you mentioned Indiana Jones before, and I think that's another thing. There's so many booby traps and things like that in that series as well that came out before this 99 movie.
Yeah. So I think Land of the Pharaohs is actually possibly the starting point for a lot of that sort of thing. It's Jack Hawkins' film from the late 1950s, I think it is, with Joan Collins in her first sort of big starring role. And I think a lot of that kind of special effects to do with Egypt seem to come, you can trace back to that particular movie.
Okay. Well, we talked about Hamunaptra, but I want to ask kind of a concept around that, because at the beginning of the movie, it's basically discovered. And then at the end of the movie, after defeating the mummy, at least until the sequel, but that's a different movie for a different day. But we see Hamunaptra just kind of imploding on itself, and it gets covered up by the sand. And so kind of throughout the storyline or the timeline of the movie is when we realize that Hamunaptra exists. Are there any real places that have been discovered and then lost again like that?
Not at all, no. Basically things which have carried out under the sand have then been excavated and then are still visible. Now, there's nothing of that kind of scale, because the whole point is that in this huge amount of time between the pharaonic times, a lot of things just simply were destroyed. And things which remained standing normally did because they were being reused as churches, mosques, people's houses, and stuff like that. So yeah, no, that's what's there has never. We haven't lost anything like that at all. In contrast, actually, archaeologists have re-erected things rather than actually sort of things falling down again.
Okay, it makes a lot of sense. I assume once we discover something, the archaeologists make sure it doesn't get lost again.
Exactly. And also, I'm not quite sure how they sort of can have lost Hamunaptra, because, again, by the 1920s, when Egypt's been pretty well surveyed, and sort of every, even into the deepest parts of the Sahara Desert. So the chance of having anything which hasn't been, which is of that kind of scale, which has been lost, is a little bit difficult too. But again, this is sort of King Solomon's mines and all the sort of Rider Haggard kinds of things. So again, I think we need to look really. It'd be interesting to actually dive into the Mummy and just see whether you can trace back each little elements of it to some specific 19th century adventure story or earlier Hollywood piece of work.
Yeah, I bet you that would be like one of those ties that you see in the movies of all the the different lines connecting to different things. There's probably a lot of different inspirations there from the movie, for sure. Now, I've talked to a lot of different historians who mention tourists coming to a place and they talk about things that they see in the movie. What's one of the biggest myths from this, or really any movie, that people tend to believe about ancient Egypt that isn't true?
I suppose it's really that it's some kind of supernatural kind of thing. You get also the New Ages and so on also coming into all this kind of stuff. They certainly had their religious faiths and so on, but most of it was all fairly sort of well set out. As far as the idea that anything is built in a sort of particularly esoteric way, we know pretty well how everything is done. And Egypt, although it's got spectacular monuments, it's got an interesting history, is simply as another country with an interesting past. You do get sort of people who sort of try and sort of have seances in temples and so on. I've led tour groups before now, and not necessarily my tour groups, but we've seen what some of the others would get up to, trying to lie in sarcophagi and get vibrations from whatever. So I think that's the problem. It in some ways turns Egypt into some kind of sort of fantasy world, rather than emphasizing what actually we've got in Egypt is a 5,000-year-old civilization with lots of really, really cool stuff in its own terms.
Adding to the fantasy and is not helping what is actually there.
Yeah. The only thing, on the other hand, I suppose, is having seen it, some people who might not otherwise have gone to Egypt might pick up the phone or go online and book a trip. And that's, and I think the key sort of antidote to all this kind of stuff is actually to go to Egypt yourself and experience what it really is, and see what the monuments really are like, what the land is really like, and those sorts of things. So whether it would be sort of films like this or some of the bizarre, quite allegedly documentaries about ancient aliens or whatever. Ultimately, if it does actually get some people to look at the real stuff and actually sort of get on a plane to Cairo, okay, well, at least it might drag people in, because there are people I know who've been dragged into even serious Egyptology via the sort of wilder shores, but then they've actually then looked into things properly and moved on like that. So, I don't know, as an Egyptologist and sort of very much a lover of Egypt, you can't, there's no such thing as bad publicity. Well, perhaps there can be, but generally speaking, if people think it's sort of this magical land and find it still magical in a rather different kind of way, hey, that's all to the good.
Now, if you were in charge of remaking The Mummy, what's one of the biggest changes that you would make?
I would probably go back to, well, I think it would probably have to be everything, quite honestly. Because what I would simply do is go and dig out the script for the original 1932 Mummy. Now, there is lots of silly stuff in there, but it's much more grounded in things, and just isn't gratuitously silly in so many places. And there's a genuine kind of menace to it. The same goes also for the 1959 one, I think, as well, where they are proper horror films rather than just sort of, because there's nothing. It's all too in. I think the problem I find with The Mummy, and also most modern sort of what they would sort of call horror, I suppose, it's all too in your face. The trick is, it's there's like the first killing in the 1932 Mummy film. All you just see is a shadow, and then a guy screams, and then sort of. So I think there's a lack, and also there's a lack of atmosphere as well. So I think if you were going to, they got it right in 1932, and they'd been better off if they'd simply done a remake, with perhaps with some bit modern technology and so on, rather than try and because there's just so many things which are wrong with it. That even though, and you haven't got a proper living mummy. You've got this thing which then transforms into a bald-headed, non-mummified bloke. So most of the time he's not even a mummy at all. So I think there's a bit of a trade descriptions issue around it as well. So no, I get the feeling the whole problem was that somebody said, "Hey, what's the next thing we're going to remake? Oh, we'll remake The Mummy," and then just sort of took the title and a couple of the characters and then ignored the rest of it. So yeah. So I'm afraid I think it would have to be go back to the drawing boards. Yeah, you could probably, and I think you'd probably want to have something. You could do something with sort of vengeful spirit from Egypt, but it couldn't be necessarily a mummy. You could have this. You could have somebody who is indeed, because if you look at the ancient Egyptian literature, there are bad beings out there in the beyond who can do nasty things to you. So, but it doesn't really. It's not going to be quite produced sort of the action movie, which clearly they were trying to do.
Yeah. So, yeah, back to the drawing board. It sounds like that's fair. Well, thank you so much for coming on to chat about The Mummy. You were talking about people learning more, and obviously there's a lot of fiction in the movie, but ancient Egypt, obviously not entirely fiction. You've written extensively about it in your book series called Lives and Afterlives. So my last question is kind of a two-parter. For listeners who want to learn more about the real history, can you share an overview of your series and then give a recommendation for where they start?
Okay, this the series of books I've been writing for the last 7 or 8 years now. It's a series of biographies of individual pharaohs. And in fact, I started off by writing a biography of Seti I, the pharaoh who features in The Mummy. And the idea of this Our Lives and Afterlives series is to start off by looking at what we know about the history of the person during their own time, then take a first look at the afterlife and look at their tombs, their funerary monuments and things like that, but also then to look at their modern afterlife. In the sense of how were they rediscovered? Because contrary to the sort of the continuity which is implied in The Mummy, there actually is a 2,000-year gap between the last time we could actually engage with ancient Egypt in its own terms, i.e. read its script, and the rediscovery of how to read this stuff again. So then we go into how do these people rediscovered? Because most of them had been completely forgotten for 2,000 years. So how do we first start discovering these people exist? Try and start finding out what they did, and so on and so forth. So this is really what this series is all about, focusing mainly on either a single pharaoh or a group of pharaohs. And the most recent one was on a group of Nubians who were pharaohs during the 8th to 7th centuries BC. Nubia is the area straddling the border between Egypt and Sudan, and is culturally different from both of those places, and had always been a place which was being attacked and exploited by the Egyptians, and then they turn the tables for 100 years, and then they become pharaohs themselves. So that's sort of where that comes from. Some years ago, I actually did write an introductory book on Egyptian history called Monarchs of the Nile, which is aimed very much at sort of anybody who wants just to start getting an idea of the history of the subject, of history of ancient Egypt. So that's probably something which is perhaps worthwhile looking into, and that's got a bibliography of other kinds of things. Also, there's quite a lot of societies out there who offer evening classes, evening lectures, and so since COVID, a lot of these are available on Zoom. Online, the days when you actually had to go out on a wet February evening to go and get your fix of Egyptology down the local college, you can actually sit in your own homes and do that. So there's a lot of that. In America, there's a group called the American Research Center in Egypt, who they've got local chapters who offer both in-person and online stuff. In the UK, there's a thing called the Egypt Exploration Society. There's a lot of other local societies around as well. So there's lots of things you can get involved with. Your local museum. All those are sort of ways into the real world of ancient Egypt, rather than the version put out by The Mummy.
Yeah, well, hopefully that'll just be the gateway to actually learning more.
Well, yeah, I know people who've got in that way, so I'm not gonna sort of poo-poo it. It's just that people need to understand that the Egypt which is in The Mummy, shall we say, bears little resemblance to the real one of now or ever.
Yeah, no, and honestly, that's one of the reasons I started this show, was because I'm curious about the movies and then the real history behind them, to dig into them, and starting to share books like yours. Like, here's a great starting point to learn more about what actually happened, and hopefully get people interested in that. So thank you again so much for your time and coming on the show.
Very happy to do it.
This episode of Based on a True Story was produced by me, Dan Lefebvre. I'd like to thank Dr. Aidan Dodson once again for helping us separate fact from fiction in The Mummy. As I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, Dr. Dodson has an excellent series of books called Lives and Afterlives. So if you've ever wanted a biography on the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, this series is that. In particular, one of those is about the pharaoh from the film Seti I. So that will be linked in the show notes along with the rest of the Lives and Afterlives series. Okay, now it's time for the answer to our two truths and a lie game from the beginning of the episode. And as a quick refresher, here are the two truths and one lie. Number one, they really did use scarab beetles to consume the flesh of those cursed in ancient Egypt. Number two, Thebes is the Greek name for Luxor. Number three, the mirror trick that we see in the movie is a real thing. Did you catch which one is a lie? Let's count it down. We'll start with number three. The mirror trick that we see in the movie is a real thing. That is true. The mirror trick that I'm referring to is the one that we see Evelyn showing us in the movie as a way of reflecting sunlight underground. She called it an ancient Egyptian trick in the movie, but it's actually a modern trick. Maybe not in all the tombs, because Dr. Dodson said that most tombs these days have LED lights now. But then again, we're talking about a movie from the 1990s before LEDs were as common as they are today. But in either case, we learned that the mirror trick is something that they use nowadays to light up tombs. That brings us to number two. Thebes is the Greek name for Luxor. That is also true. In the movie, Thebes is the home of Imhotep, the city of the living. And as we learned, Thebes was a real place, but it's actually the Greek name of Luxor. And that was the religious capital of Egypt from about 1500 BC to about 1100 BC. That means number one is the lie. They really did use scarab beetles to consume the flesh of those cursed in ancient Egypt. Dr. Dodson explained that the Egyptians symbolized the sun god as a scarab beetle pushing his dung around as if it's the sun coming over the horizon. So scarabs certainly were a part of ancient Egypt, but they were not the man-eating beetles that we see in the movie. If you enjoyed today's episode, I hope you'll consider helping me buy more treats for my cat to replace the ones that I just used, keeping him from knocking this whole setup down while I'm recording. You'll even get your name in the producer's credits that you'll see here in a minute if you're watching the video version. So if you want to see your name as a producer in the credits for the next video, sorry, but you missed it on this one. But if you want to catch the next one, you can learn all about that at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/support. Once again, that's basedonatruestorypodcast.com/support. Until next time, thanks so much for spending your time with us today. I'll chat with you again really soon.